Hey there, I'm Zach Abramowitz, and I am Legally Disrupted. In episode 30 of Zach Abramowitz is Legally Disrupted, we talk with Axiom's Chief Strategy Officer, Katherine Kemnitz. Katherine and I got into a little spat on LinkedIn because someone from Axiom had posted about the fact that CLM was going to be disrupted by AI, and I argued, well, ALSPs, like Axiom, alternative legal service providers, may be disrupted as well. We got into an entire conversation on the podcast about how incumbents and how incumbent ALSPs in particular plan to respond to the AI disruption. I think Katherine had some really interesting points. She's very thoughtful, and she's been in the legal industry, working in legal innovation for years. So let's get right to it. Let's get disrupted. So, Katherine, you mentioned in our short little pre-production that you've been in this space for a while. Before we kind of jump into the topic, give people a sense of your experience in this industry and your current role at Axiom.
Well, it's interesting. I was doing the math, and without wanting to date myself too much, it's been over 3 decades since I first stepped into law school. So it's been a while. But I think my path has been a bit unconventional. So I've had the privilege of looking at this from a variety of standpoints. I'm obviously originally from Europe, went to law school there, then NYU, and I started at Sherman and Sterling, which now you know Sherman. So I practiced for about 8-9 years there in capital markets. When I left, I joined Thomson Reuters, not in a practicing capacity, but in a corporate development. So the job was really circa, 2010 at the time, looking at all the legal tech, all the content providers in the space and driving the acquisition for the legal division. So did transaction.
So were you there when they acquired PLC?
I did the deal.
You did. So you worked extensively on this deal.
I was toe to toe and head to head with Rob and Chris for 4 months to complete that transaction. I could tell you a lot about it, but it's a really interesting just sidebar, because in some ways the vision of what led to that transaction at the time has the technological power to potentially happen. So there's sort of an arc with that. But I did do that deal, and I actually was working when I left. We were just wrapping up sort of the first phase of the integration, both in the UK and US. And that's when I joined Axiom. They were at the time looking to open an office where I lived. TR has a very strong presence in Minnesota, where I'm now based. And they wanted to open, Axiom wanted to open in the Twin Cities as well, considering the concentration of Fortune 100 companies and so on. So I first started with that. But I loved the company, but realized quickly I probably wasn't just going to be a field salesperson forever. And at the time, Mark Harris was looking to, as you probably know, had ambition to go public. And considering my background, I thought that was wonderful, but probably fairly unrealistic considering the state of the company at the time. And so started working on really public company readiness, operations, and so on, which led to another set of transactions that I managed, which is the 2019 sort of reorg of Axiom and refocus on the talent space. Before becoming CLO of Axiom, and eventually with the premier acquisition and our CEO David McVeigh, we realized we were probably spending only 10 to 20% of our time really on legal matters, but actually tackling a lot of the strategy, and decided to sort of upgrade the legal function with a true career GC and put me in strategy, which is where I've been for a few years now. So I've been at Axiom for about 11 years. Condensed version of all that.
Yeah, and Mark really was, a visionary founder, and it is interesting to see. He would very often, when I've spoken in the past, he was always very realistic about meeting the industry where they were, and there were all kinds of innovations that he really prioritized and would have liked to have moved forward on, but just felt like that wasn't possible at the time. And I think it's an interesting thing about him, because if you think about the company, Axiom is obviously, has redefined in some sense the law, right? Which I know was, a big part of the original brand and redefining what that meant. But at the same time, as kind of being a visionary, also like very pragmatic and realistic about where the industry is and how much you can move it, how much innovation is really sustainable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the questions that he raised at the time are very sort of timely today again. I was reflecting on this when I joined Axiom. I remember just before joining, I flew in to meet with Mark, and we spent a couple of hours in that conference room, and he sort of whiteboarded all his vision. And at the time, I was coming from TR, and he almost had a vision of what could happen into the transactional space that we had seen somewhat evolving in litigation with e-discovery. And I remember thinking, if this guy is like 30% right, I want to be part of that journey. I think how right Mark was at the time is still unfolding. There's a big time component in legal about how fast things can move, how big the changes can be. And I think the direction of travel, though, is absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and so were you also involved with the Pangea 3 acquisition at Thomson Reuters?
No, I came right after. Right after.
If you're thinking already about like the alternative structure, they were sort of, in a way, I think of them as like one of the OGs of alternative staffing.
Yeah, and in some ways, the whole evolution of what managed services were for the past 10 years and what we're seeing now. And I remember even the strategic decisions we make at Axiom in 2019 tied to what we're seeing now in the disruption by tech, because part of the gamble was to say, we do think tech is going to evolve. We do think we're not the ones who are going to build it. And so we need to figure out how to grow while that happens, but not double down on the side of the business that we were concerned might be the most disruptable, which is what's happening today. And so it's interesting to see all these threads kind of coming together with the acceleration of GenAI.
Right. And I think, it's interesting, as you were saying before about like the PLC deal, and that even then a lot of the sort of promise of what you want, of what you imagined the PLC acquisition could be, you think is sort of playing out now. Can you say a little more of that?
Yeah, because so practical law at the time was described as a crown jewel of legal from a content standpoint. It was created by top-notch lawyers with really strong editorial guidelines. It was much stronger in the UK than it was in the US. So the promise for the TR acquisition was certainly to expand into the US, where there are some pretty big hurdles. Like when you do something in the US, you kind of have to have a 50-state local level content. That was not what PLC was doing. TR was. So bringing those two sort of cultures and altitudes and approach to content were really important. But the idea, though, is to say, well, hang on, you have all this crazy content they've developed. And I've been describing it lately because we were talking about it at Axiom a bit like this is the analog version, right? You have your practice node, you have your drafting node, and you almost you see GenAI as the possibility of making that PLC become this hologram, this associate with all the content that's truly interactive, where you can really not just say, here's what you need to do in an IPO, but here's your IPO process. Boom, it's all there. And half of the stuff is pre-drafted, but not pre-drafted as a static form, pre-drafted from your precedent or your company's data. So I think there's a lot of things like that I'm sure even the TR crew is probably just chomping at the bits to accelerate, but that has the promise when you have the kind of content that they have.
And I practiced, sort of around that time, in 2010, 2013. And the thing I remember about Practical Law Company was a certain, because I was a user. And I remember feeling like, on the one hand, this should be very valuable to me, but how often is it the case that I can take the templates that they have on Practical Law Company and then quickly jump back into my practice and learn? And as a baby attorney, you're doing everything you can to kind of catch up, while the train is moving, right?
Yes.
And that was I think a very big challenge for me. I think very often about how amazing it would be to have Gen AI tools, even something as basic as a Chat GPT, today were I at the law firm, because half the time you're just trying to learn things on your own. And there's a kind of culture of don't ask the senior attorney, figure it out on your own. I think today, like what I would do with like a hand markup from an attorney that I could barely read and didn't really understand, I think I could probably do wonders having ChatGPT just to walk me through the senior attorney's hand markup. So I think there's so much today from a training perspective that you can do that you just couldn't do then, where PLC was, like you said, sort of this like static version of training. As you've been in this for a while, At what point did you start paying a significant amount of attention to generative AI? Because I think over the last 3 years, different people have had sort of different journeys.
Yeah.
Where was this something that like locked in for you, where you sort of thought, okay, this is something sort of categorically different? And I should ask, like, do you see it as being categorically different, or do you see it as like incremental improvements?
I see it as categorically different. And I think in part because, and we can come back to this point, because I think the tech that even though you're still going to have some of the sort of reflexes of the legal industry, legal will not be able to insulate itself from this transformation in the way that it has in the past. It's just going to change the way we live, the way we do things, from your kids' homework to your more sophisticated work. And so we're going to have to roll with this, and it's going to mean a lot of things in legal. I would say we've definitely been paying attention to it. If you remember, even in 2019, when we had, technology, we spun that off. So we've had that sort of, okay, we are making a conscious decision to focus on the core business because we think right now that is where our strength lies. And we don't think we are the ones who can give those businesses the right attention they need to thrive, whether it's, what's now factor or knowable, same kind of logic. And I think that was really the right decision.
Both of which, by the way, I should note, have gone on to be, fairly successful ventures.
And they found
in their own right. Yeah,
exactly. Like the acquisition of Knowable and Mark and Alec continuing with that for a while, I think was the right way to kind of have a big tech-centric company with resource to kind of really accelerate the vision of that. And equally, Factor sort of needed to be its own space because the economics of that model versus Axiom are quite different. And even the sales motion is quite different. So the idea that you can have all these things and have synergies in your sales channel is often a little bit delusional. You need very separate kind of skill set to sell different things. So we made that decision to kind of focus on the people side, which I think was right. But a lot of us who were there continue to have that mindset of what's the next thing, what's the innovation, where is it going to come from, to be able to seize this. And I think the GenAI piece, probably, I want to say 2.5, 3 years ago, is when we were like, okay, now we're paying attention. And for us, it's always been a question of where do we come in? How do we engage with this? When is it going to be right? We for instance, have annual offsite for strategy with the entire leadership team every summer. It's been a couple of summers where we've had days dedicated to GenAI and how we were going to approach this. But again, because we were back to being people first in a way, the way we had to engage needed to see where the tech was landing a little bit. And the moment we felt, okay, now we have a view of where that connection point comes in, we started really going aggressively at it.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to talk originally was we were discussing online this post, and someone had been basically from Axiom, and I think Chris Fricklin, if I'm not mistaken, had made a post about CLM and how he thought that CLM was kind of like a doomed vertical. And not only do I agree, I have been writing this since 2022. I have been very consistent. And by the way, because of an acquisition, I am actually a holder of Agiloft stock. So I sometimes say this in a way where I'm like, I have to be real with you. It's not exactly in my incentives to say this, but I do think that in general, for a variety of reasons, I've felt that CLM is a troubled vertical. And in an era in which it seems like every single SaaS vertical is now trying to be redefined and rebuilt with AI, I certainly could imagine that the CLM is disruptable because I think it had problems even before AI came along. I'm not 100% sure that as products that the CLM is able to be rebuilt, quote unquote, AI first, which I think is a separate topic.
Yeah, it's a tough.
But one I'd like to get into, I want to get your perspective on as well. Yeah. But I sort of made the point, and I made it about Axiom, but I think it applies to ALSP in general. I think it applies to a lot of businesses, which is I was saying, listen, yes, it's true. CLM is certainly in trouble. I've got slides on it. I've given talks about this. Could not agree more. However, I think we sometimes get into this like finger pointing, not finger pointing where it's like, oh,
Just the other guys are in trouble.
that company's in trouble because AI is going to really wreck and redefine their vertical. And I have to tell you, even within my own business, we think every single day about is the service that we provide in the form that we provide it today still valuable? Does it need to be redesigned? And I think that this is something my sort of big point approach to this topic in general is that any business, especially one in professional services, especially ones that are built on human talent, we like are not immune. I think we are in very much like in the crosshairs and need to adapt, not because we're going to be automated out of a job, but just because the standards in general and the expectations of what people want is changing so rapidly. So that was my sort of feeling about it. Now, talk to me first about ALSP and where you think, generally speaking, like where is the impact of AI on alternative legal service providers like Axiom?
So first, I would say I completely agree with you. We're immensely at risk. I think if we did nothing, if we watched this and thought, no, we're good enough, we can, our clients will sort of keep liking what we do and keep growing the company, whatever, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. Part of, I think, what we look at is where are the opportunities, where are the key risks? And you see GenAI say, well, what if this wiped out half our business in 2 years? Do you have a response to that worry, right? And interestingly, too, we are private equity owned. These questions do get asked.
Yeah.
So there is no sitting there and saying we're not at risk, we're immune. I think the question is, number one, how do you mitigate the piece of the risk that you can mitigate? And two, where is the opportunity? And I think the two go hand in hand. You mentioned, I think you posed the innovator's dilemma and all that, which is, anybody who's worked with Mark Harris, by the way, probably has those books as a part of their Bible stack. But I think we're in a position of being two things at once. We are both still a disruptor for the incumbents, law firms, the old way of doing things, the static aspect of the industry, and we're equally an incumbent to be disrupted by those who might do what we do better. And in my mind, if, for lack of better sense, if somebody's going to cannibalize us, it should be ourselves. And so we needed to kind of see if we're going to go, if someone can go to clients and say, look, I have Harvey Oligori, name it, and I can do what you want to do in, half the time, half the price, 10th of the time. Do you think we're going to stay in the game? No, we won't. So we want to be the ones going to the client and say, we actually tested all this. We actually worked it out. We've trained the lawyers. We can do what we used to do for this much, which by the way, law firms would do for triple that. But we even compared to what we would offer if we gave you the traditional, so fully human version of this, be one lawyer or 20. We now have this other thing. And we can do it that way. And what is, I think, the key differentiation for what an ALSP, to get to your point about where ALSP, and an ALSP is we should delve a little bit into the various components.
It's a very, very broad term.
It's sort of a hodgepodge. I was very excited. I think it was a year ago or so when TR finally published an ALSP report where they broke that down. Because I was like, we have all the tech innovators in there. We have managed services. We have Axiom. So, but for the kinds of things that we do, we wanted to pass on value to clients. And that's a big difference with law firms where we can go to clients and say, not only do we do all this, but you're going to see it. You get the savings because, you're going to pay less human hours than you would otherwise. And we also equally going to allow you to start a continued journey into technology because you're going to have visibility into the tech we vetted. You're going to have transparency in all the work. This is not behind a curtain because we continue to be an extension of the in-house department. So it's really for them.
So I want to ask that question in particular because I think this does sort of get now into like the nuances of the different models.
Yeah.
So I know that Axiom has staffing business, but I also know you have Axiom Counsel in Arizona. So
we actually shut that down.
So you've shut that down. But my question is then when you're providing a service and the lawyers are using a technology, is it is it something that's on Axiom's back end, or does then every attorney who is an extension of that legal department then also have to then use the AI tools that legal department is using?
So it depends. So there's two parts to this. How do you do it from a tech standpoint? And then there's the regulatory aspect, which you're also touching on a little bit. So Axiom Advice and Counsel, we had started in Arizona. At the time, this was, I mentioned we always look for the way where we can innovate, do something new. The re-regulation there really got us very excited about starting a law firm and basically allowed us to take the extra step towards can we give the legal advice? And I did quite well. But this is where, GenAI changed the world on us. And when we started having to make decisions around where we would focus our time and effort in the innovation sphere, at that point, it was a bit of a difficult decision, but one we had to make, say, look, where GenAI can take us versus what we're going to be able to do just with that structure and all the sort of resource allocation that it required made that choice quite important to do. And it's in a way, it's part of the thing when you innovate and try things, you have to be able to not fall in love with your own ideas too much because you never know when something can disrupt even that.
Yeah,
so setting
absolutely.
aside the law advice, in Axiom, all our lawyers are always under the supervision of the client, right? So it's fine because the client must be, so take a Ligor, if you were to do a contract review, we're going to really work with the client to kind of calibrate how the review is done. They have to be involved in that. We can't just say, oh, this is the way we do it. This is our legal opinion. We could do it with a law firm, but this is what the clients do. Now, in terms of the actual tech, there's kind of two generic paths. In order to do it the way we do it right now for large projects, we have to use our own tech stack unless the client already has the solution. And part of the benefit of what we do sometimes is it can be really hard for a large enterprise to get a technology sort of vetted internally to be adopted by the in-house department. But they are fine if our lawyers, for instance, use our laptops, they have then the tech on there. They can do that. And then they're able to see the output, which facilitate then potentially the notion of, hey, could we actually adopt that solution? It's particularly true with Draft Pilot, which is more for drafting assistance and so on. Yeah. So it's kind of, it depends on, are you making, are lawyers in your environment? And I would say about half of them are in client environment, or are you in ours?
So the interesting thing that you brought up about budgets for in-house departments. So I've seen this, of course, play out at a number of clients as well as just contacts within the industry, which is that a legal department is the cost center, and they're certainly not first on the budget. I will say I think that it's changed in two ways. Number one, I have actually met with chief information officers at publicly traded companies that say, hey, listen, we wanted to bring in AI and get some quick wins. And we've seen a lot about the AI's impact on the legal department. This feels like a fairly low risk way for us to do some testing. Now that's crazy to anyone who's been in the space for a while. You're like, where do you start with legal? But I have seen this happen. And I think the other thing that I think, so that's one, is that the C-suite has read the stories at some point in the journal or in or wherever about lawyers and AI. And I think the other thing that continues to happen is anytime there's any kind of AI snafu in the courts, it immediately makes the mainstream press. For whatever reason, the AI in courts is something that gets reader eyeballs because mainstream news will run with these stories often. So I think it's more in the sort of the public conscious that AI can have impact on legal. The other thing is, in many instances, I actually see legal departments outpacing law firms on AI adoption, which I wouldn't have guessed. But the reason that I've seen that happen is legal departments very often have access to either ChatGPT, Google Gemini, or Claude by virtue of a company-wide license program. So maybe it's not a Harvey or a Ligor or a specific product, but they are able to get in there and start working, with the AI. And in some sense, that's been fairly surprising to me. Have you seen that? And how is that impacting how you guys think about AI.
Yeah,
and
so I
legal.
agree with what you just laid out as an observation, and I would unpack a few things. So one, it's really interesting. There's a big macro point, which is we live in a world right now where I think legal is a headline all the time. Whether it's constitutional law or GenAI and headline, we live in a world where all of a sudden all of these things of legal having to help you navigate the world today, and that strategic evolution is probably the strongest I've seen it, because risk has changed. It changes on a moment's notice. There's so many regulations that are issued, orders and things like that. Like in-house has to move fast and be on the ball to really save help guide the company. It's not just mitigate risk on the back end. It's like, okay, can we even take that next step we want to take? So I think that's elevated the function. The mandate to adopt AI, to your point, is coming from the top. It's the CEO saying, all of you guys, whether you're marketing, legal, you name it, need to find those savings and use AI to do it, because that's going to be true across the board. And this is what I meant a little earlier when I said the specificity of legal is eroded. You can no longer say, well, you can do that everywhere, but not in legal. Because, to your point, the executives are educated enough to say, well, hang on, you were saying that when the tech wasn't there. We now have people that say it is. So we cannot continue to let legal not have that. And I think part of why legal can sometimes feel like the low-hanging fruit, it's its technology immaturity. It feels harder when you have Salesforce or an ERP to say, what else are you going to put on top of that doesn't disrupt all these tech processes and stuff that we already have? In legal, you often have done very little. And so it feels like just go do something. And by the way, you always say it takes so long, and surely your contract is not that complicated. And a lot of internal clients, commercial, whatever, will look at what the legal function does, often saying, just do it faster. So it feels like a very right moment to do that. I'm interested in, and a bit surprised as well, with how the adoption has happened between law firms and in-house. They have adopted faster. Our data shows that, to your point, a lot of them are adopting generic solutions, not legal specific solutions. And I think
that seems to be the conclusion of basically every single industry survey, all the industry wide data.
Everybody's aligned on that. And what I find interesting is that it does bring the question of what will actually adoption look like in legal 2 years from now? Because is it going to be, okay, they started with that, then they'll upgrade to legal solution? Or will the generics become good enough in legal matters that with the right training and supervision, the legal tech feels like just a skin over that? And I'm not sure where it's probably going to be a bit of both. And maybe we have multiple tools for different things, but it's allowed in-house to just go out there and do it and use it. And part of it, I think, ties to the desire for in-house to sort of move the flow of spend from law firms to doing things themselves. And there's two types of work that goes to law firm. The stuff you really want a law firm for, which is, specific, sophisticated legal advice, kind of making sure you have air cover for whatever it is you're doing, vet the family, kind of stuff. But then there's also stuff you just send to law firms because you don't have time and capacity. And that is causing a lot of spend that law firm, that now companies are trying to go after. And if you take that and say, well, we can keep that in-house with AI, we might just be able to do it, well enough, like a 50-state survey or review of a bunch of documents. And maybe to get to your point of what does it mean for Axiom? Well, hang out. In-house is not just in-house. In-house is in-house and its extensions. And if we not only do it in-house, but we might have, fine, if it's 100 docs, I can run it through AI myself. If it's 50,000, I do want somebody with true technological knowledge and ability to kind of calibrate the tech, make sure all the cell queries are right, make sure we test and validate along the way to be with us. So we want the lawyers, the humans with the tech. That's where we come in. And so that creates, I think, a bit of a shift into the in-house ecosystem that I'm really interested in seeing evolve over the next year. And our bet as a company is to say, we want to be more in that. Like, I do not know.
So how does that play out? I'm curious.
I think you have to have the agility to say something today may be 80% done by a human, 20% per tech. And maybe that evolves. In a couple of years, it's the reverse. It's 80, but the human is there. We're on the people side of things. So we continue to believe that for the foreseeable future, certainly, but maybe forever, whatever technology we use, especially in legal matters, will require some level of humans who first know how to use it, but also can make sure that once you get that output, because when everybody has the tech, somebody's going to have a competitive edge over that. And that's going to come from the invention and the creativity. I think that will, of the stuff that's not yet into the language models. You have to be willing to say, we might have to suffer that shift and repivot on the technology usage side as a business model. And going back to innovative solution, right? It's always go what after the work that's the clients that are not served well, the business model innovation, and kind of roll with it versus being sort of stuck in your way and saying, I hope we hold that, wall as long as possible. And eventually it breaks and you've lost everything. We want to be bending with it and learning from clients, and more importantly, serving clients, so that while they do this, we are with them. And then we'll figure out what that model means in the end. It may mean new pricing models. It may mean, new ways to engage with us as repeat buyers, which a lot of clients are. And then we'll see where the law firms position themselves for what's left after that. But I think all these things kind of move together.
Yeah, and I just think that it's so important. You mentioned that already 2.5 years ago you started thinking about this. That there were days that you were spending as a team looking into AI. To me, that's the first stage. And what I always tell people is you need to start using the products, not specifically because if you didn't use them today, you'd be undercut on price. I think that at some point that is going to happen, and I think that I think you're definitely losing out on opportunities that you could be right now. But the biggest thing is, if you don't sort of look the AI right in the eyes and understand what it is and what it is capable of, and what is what is sort of like the technical architecture behind it, so that you sort of really understand how it's working and appreciate that, then your brain is never going to want to jump to the point of figuring out what comes next. Our brains don't want to think about what comes next. We only do that when we're like, okay, now there's really a reason. Now I have to rethink this. If you don't expose yourself to this, if you don't sort of let it seep into your brain that this is a real force, something that may require me to do something, right, to make adjustments, then I think you kind of don't get there.
When we get asked, okay, do law departments, what are you seeing the law department do? Give me the playbook of how to do this. The only common ground it can really give them is the best law departments got started. Literally, they got started. They said, okay, dear ChatGPT, GenAI, you name it, I'm going to wrestle with you. I'm going to figure out what that means. So maybe you find 2 or 3 people in your department super excited and say, you have a month to kind of go play. We're going to do it in a safe. You can build enough of a playground, sandbox, whatever, to preserve your security and all of that. So that's a given. But go basically start doing stuff you hate doing on your day job. We're using AI, and come back when you have a good use case. And go from there, right? Little by little by little. To your point around muscle sort of agility, I'm always struck when I play with my kids on a game. I'm like, literally, I can't move the cat, right? And they're doing like 3-dimensional, like somersault. And in ChatGPT, it's a bit the same. You have to kind of build that muscle before, because you will be otherwise. You're only extending your gap if you don't start at the basics. But I think some people feel, my gosh, I have to be this super advanced person to get started. I remember I'll tell you a story, doing about a homework with my kid, and I was like, she needed an image of a marketplace in the Middle Ages. Like, I don't know where, like, I have hundreds of books, I don't know where to find. ChatGPT would say, create an image that looks like a cartoon. And they need to be bartering. That was the theme. So great, we get an image. I said, well, it's barter, and you have one that holds a purse coin and the other one a fish. So let's change the purse coin for salt. And that was great. Adapt the image. Now the problem is the fish has 2 tails and no head. ChatGPT. So then you say, okay, fix that. ChatGPT fixes it. But now the fish is flying, not in the hand. Fix that. And it was a very vivid way of explaining why it's so great and where the shortcomings are. Because now you apply this to contract. And you say, well, it can give me the thing, but I'm going to have to build that muscle to really identify where it's still coming short. And that takes reps. lots and lots of reps. And the in-house departments who get started with that, identify the use case. And it's true for law firm. I mean, I get calls from law firm where like, we have all these tools. We don't know how to get our associates to use it. And you're like, well, have you asked them stuff they hate doing that takes time and try to map that to a use case? And oh, no, we haven't. I was like, well, trust me, if you do something they hate doing fast, they're going to want to use the tech. But it's just these like things to get started that are really important to do, I think.
Katherine, thank you so much for coming on and discussing this. Obviously, we'll be following the ways that Axiom is moving and shifting and pivoting with everything going on in AI right now, but really appreciate you sharing.
I love being here. Thank you so much.